Have you ever felt like the one person everyone else could always depend on until the moment you needed someone yourself? Maybe your story, like mine, began with small requests. Can you help with the groceries this week? Do you mind watching the house while we're away? Each time you said yes, believing that's what family does. But somewhere along the line, those little favors blurred into something bigger, something invisible, yet impossibly heavy. My name is Madison Cole, and for most of my adult life, I was the silent backbone of my family, the fixer, the rescuer, the one who never seemed to need saving. It's easy to believe that love is measured by sacrifice, especially when you're raised to put everyone else first. In my family, I learned early that being the strong one meant swallowing my own needs, so others could feel safe. When the furnace broke in the dead of winter, I wired the money before they even asked. When my dad lost his job, I paid the mortgage, no questions, no conditions. When my little brother Max needed a new start after another failed dream, I gave him the keys to my apartment and my trust, even when it cost me my peace. But what happens when all that giving, quiet, steady, unconditional, goes unrecognized? When the very people you love most begin to expect your sacrifice not as a gift, but as a given. If you've ever stayed up late balancing someone else's bills, or put your dreams on hold for the sake of family, you know the feeling. The world tells us that selflessness is a virtue, but it rarely warns us about the loneliness that can creep in when your story becomes a background detail in someone else's life. This is not a story about anger. It's not about revenge or grand gestures or shutting doors forever. It's about something far quieter, but much harder to name, the moment you realize that your worth can't be measured by what you provide. It's about the silent breaking point when a lifetime of small surrenders suddenly feels like too much. And most of all, it's about what comes next, the courage to let go, to set boundaries, and to finally choose yourself even when it hurts. So if you've ever wondered what might happen if you stop carrying the weight that everyone else put on your shoulders, or if you've been told you're too strong to ever need help, this story is for you. Together, we'll walk through the messy, complicated, and ultimately liberating journey of discovering what it means to love your family without losing yourself along the way. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to say, "This time, I choose me." Let's begin. From the outside, my family always looked like a storybook version of normal. Our little blue house in a quiet Seattle suburb, white trim flower beds along the walk, the smell of fresh coffee drifting out the kitchen window on Saturdays. Neighbors waved when they walked their dogs. I still remember how Mrs. Peters from next door used to say, "Your family always seems so close." I suppose in many ways we were. My parents, Jack and Elaine, met at a community college mixer and never left each other's side. They worked hard, loved harder, and raised me and my younger brother Max with every intention of giving us the life they never had. But what people didn't see, the part hidden behind our well-tended lawn and cheerful front door, was how much I quietly kept together. It began with little things, as these things often do. Organizing school fundraisers, volunteering to drive Max to soccer, helping Dad with the old computer. Because you're just better at these things, Maddie. I grew into my role without noticing. By the time I was a teenager, being the reliable one felt as natural as breathing. Looking back, it's almost funny how quickly helping out becomes holding up. When I was 17 and Dad slipped a disc at work, I picked up shifts at the grocery store after school, so we wouldn't fall behind on bills. My friends would ask why I always seemed tired, why I turned down parties or college campus visits. I told them I had responsibilities, and that was true, but it was more than that. I felt responsible. Years later, when Mom lost her job during the recession, I was already living in a studio apartment downtown, but my paychecks found their way home. I'd Venmo what I could, sometimes skipping my own meals to make sure the fridge was full for them. When Max's band needed rent money for a practice space, it was me who quietly signed the check. Even when I got promoted at work, I barely celebrated. There was always another leak to fix, another loan, to pay another person in the family who needed something I could give. It's strange how, after a while, people stop seeing what you give. They only see that things don't fall apart. For a long time, I thought this was just what good daughters did. You put your head down and make things easier for everyone else. But it wasn't until a friend, someone I trusted, said, "Madison, you're always the first to show up, but who shows up for you?" that I paused. I realized I'd become the family's invisible backbone. No one asked if I could afford to help. They assumed I could. No one wondered if I wanted to say yes. They assumed I would. I watched as Max, with his easy smile and endless optimism, drifted from one plan to the next, never quite landing. I envied him sometimes for how lightly he seemed to move through life, how naturally he expected things to work out. He wasn't unkind, just unburdened. My parents worried about him, coddled him, made excuses when he failed. I, on the other hand, was the steady one. That meant every slip missed payment. Broken car last-minute crisis was gently nudged my way. "You're just so good at handling things, Maddie. What I wish they'd said just once, thank you. I see what you do." It's taken me years to understand that sometimes the people who hold everything together are the least likely to ask for help. We wear the label reliable like a badge of honor, but it can quickly become a cage. The world rewards people who keep the plates spinning, who step in before things go wrong. But in the process, it's all too easy to lose sight of where family ends and you begin. I've met others in this quiet club, the eldest daughters, the successful siblings, the adult children whose names are never in the will, but whose hands pay every bill. I've heard their stories in book clubs and therapy waiting rooms, in the break room at work, and late-night texts from friends who whisper, "It's just easier if I handle it." And I've learned that while giving feels good, it also comes with a price. When you're always the strong one, people forget you're still human. The lesson, I suppose, is that being needed isn't the same as being valued. The invisible backbone may keep the house standing, but without care, even steel can bend. As I grew into adulthood, I tried to tell myself I didn't mind being the go-to. After all, wasn't it better to be the person people trusted? But slowly, I began to notice the invisible line between love and obligation. The favors grew heavier, the thanks grew shorter, and sometimes I'd wake up at 3 a.m., worrying about how I'd cover both my rent and theirs. I watched my parents dote on Max, forgiving his debts, excusing his disappearances, hoping each new promise would be the one that stuck. Sometimes I wondered if my stability was the very thing that made me invisible, if I'd made life too easy for everyone else to notice when I was struggling. It's a strange and quiet heartbreak to realize the people you love most might love your usefulness more than they love your presence. And yet I kept going, telling myself that maybe one day all this giving would finally be seen. But of course, families are rarely that simple. The trouble with being the one who never needs help is that eventually people stop offering it. They forget to ask about your dreams. They don't notice when your voice trembles or your eyes well up after you say, "I'm fine." That's how the cycle continues. The reliable become invisible, the needy become cherished, and everyone insists. That's just how families work. But deep down, I knew there had to be more. There had to be a way to love deeply without losing yourself. There had to be a moment where the invisible backbone was allowed to rest. And maybe, just maybe, that moment would come with the next turn of the story. Because the truth is, every foundation has its cracks, and even the strongest support can't hold up a house built on unequal ground. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover the hidden cost of always saying yes and what it means to finally put yourself first. It's funny how the word sacrifice sounds so noble when you're young. You imagine heroes on movie screens, dramatic gestures, a single moment when you give up something precious, and everyone notices. But real life has a quieter way of chipping away at your dreams. My own sacrifices for my family weren't one big scene, but thousands of tiny choices. The grad school application I never finished because Mom said she couldn't sleep if I moved so far. The internship in Boston I politely declined when Dad's back gave out again. The relationship I let drift away, afraid to ask someone new to understand a family that always came first. No one ever asked me to put my life on hold. But somehow, the needs of my family always seemed heavier than my own hopes. I used to think I was alone in this, but the more I shared my story with friends or even strangers, the more I realized how common it is, especially for women, for eldest children, for anyone whose strength becomes a family safety net. I remember meeting Emily, a colleague from another department, at a company picnic one summer. She'd flown home every other weekend for years to care for her ailing grandmother quietly, scheduling her life around someone else's doctor visits and prescriptions. "My brother says I make it look easy," she told me, "but sometimes I wish someone would ask if I ever get tired." We laughed together about things that weren't really funny, hiding receipts for bills paid in secret, learning how to fix a sink because calling a plumber was too expensive. Stories like ours are everywhere, tucked inside the lives of people who always say yes even when no one hears them. There's an American saying that you can't pour from an empty cup, but nobody teaches you how to notice when yours is almost dry. Looking back, I see the warning signs I ignored. The sleepless nights worrying about 2 rent payments instead of one. The quiet resentment that crept in when Max crashed his car and I was the only one Dad called. The moments of shame when I wondered if I was a bad daughter for wanting something, anything, just for myself. I pushed those feelings aside, reminding myself how lucky I was to have a family at all. But the truth is, every act of self-denial left a mark even if it was invisible. And each mark made it a little harder to remember who I was before I started carrying everyone else. It would be easy to blame my parents for taking my help for granted, or Max for never quite growing up. But sometimes the hardest truth is that I let it happen. I let my boundaries blur because I was afraid of being seen as selfish. I said yes because no felt like a betrayal. It's a mistake I see over and over, especially in the stories friends have shared with me. There's Jake, who paid off his sister's student loans only to realize she expected him to do it again when she overspent. Or Maria, who worked weekends so her mom could take time off only to be told she owes it to the family for being the successful one. Each of us was trained in our own way to believe that love means self-sacrifice and that saying no is an act of abandonment. The lesson I'm still learning is that real love survives boundaries. It doesn't require you to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. Sometimes love means showing up with open hands. Other times, it means walking away for your own sake. It's okay to want something different for yourself. It's okay to recognize when giving has turned into losing. Most of all, it's okay to ask for help, even if you've never needed it before. If no one ever told you that, I'm telling you now, your needs matter too. As I reflect on all the ways I tried to be everything for everyone I can see, now that my sacrifices didn't go unnoticed, they simply became invisible, folded into the daily routines of my family's life. It's the invisible work, the silent yes behind every problem solved that keeps families running, but eventually, even the strongest shoulders grow tired. I began to wonder what would happen if just once I stopped saying yes. What would my family do if I stepped back even for a moment and let them feel the absence of all I'd given? That question, whispered in the quiet hours of early morning, became the crack in my resolve. It didn't mean I loved them any less. It just meant I was ready to learn what loving myself might look like. I didn't know it yet, but the answer would come sooner and more painfully than I ever expected. Because sometimes the cost of always saying yes isn't just your dreams. It's the realization that in a family built on sacrifice, the person who gives the most is often the easiest to overlook. And so as summer faded into autumn and another stack of bills appeared on my desk, I found myself hesitating for the first time in years. The habit to fix, to help to step in, still there, but softer now. In its place, a quiet voice grew stronger, asking, "What about you, Madison? What would you do if you finally put yourself first?" Little did I know, everything was about to change the day I stumbled on a folder that would force me to answer that very question once and for all. There are moments in life that split time in half before and after. For me, it happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon with the soft click of a folder opening in my parents' dining room. I'd stopped by to help my dad scan some health insurance paperwork. The house looked the same as always, a little cluttered but full of warmth. My dad's favorite mug sat on the table, a half-finished crossword nearby. There was nothing unusual in the air, nothing to suggest my world was about to tilt. But as I sorted through the stack of bills and forms, I found an envelope labeled Estate Plan Final Copy in my mother's careful handwriting. I shouldn't have looked, I know. But curiosity and maybe something deeper drew me in. Inside was the latest version of their will, notarized just 2 months before. Page after page detailed what would happen to everything my parents owned, the house I'd paid to repair, the little savings account I topped up when things were tight, even a life insurance policy I never knew about. All of it, every last cent, was to go to Max. My name appeared only once in a single line that read, "We love both of our children equally and trust them to care for one another." That was it. No mention of the years I'd spent quietly patching holes, paying bills, or turning down my own opportunities so my family wouldn't feel afraid. I was a footnote in the story of my own life, and for the first time, I realized just how invisible I'd become. It's a strange kind of heartbreak to learn you are valued for your strength, but never cherished for your sacrifices. I sat there stunned while the scanner hummed and my dad walked back in, coffee in hand. He looked at me, then at the folder in my hands, and sighed a long, tired sound that said he knew exactly what I'd found. "We figured you'd understand." He said, his voice gentle but distant. I wanted to shout that understanding isn't the same as agreement, that being strong doesn't mean I don't bleed. Instead, I just nodded, unable to form the words. In that moment, I saw the truth: my family didn't mean to hurt me. They simply never considered that I could be hurt. This happens more often than we think. In families everywhere, the responsible one is quietly asked to shoulder, more simply because they can. The troubled sibling is given second, third, and fourth chances because they need it more. I remembered a friend, Julia, whose parents refinanced their house to pay off her brother's gambling debt, while she, the one with a stable job, was left to figure things out alone. Another colleague, Brandon, told me his family would praise his achievements in public, but in private always expected him to pick up the slack for his sister. It's a story that repeats across cultures and generations. The strong are taken for granted. The struggling are sheltered, and the scales of love tip quietly out of balance. There's a reason for this, I think, a cultural reflex that says, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. In theory, it sounds compassionate. In practice, it can turn love into an equation where stability becomes a reason to neglect someone's humanity. Families, even in modern America, often justify these choices with phrases like, "You don't need as much help," or "You'll be fine on your own." What they miss is the silent pain of being expected to survive without comfort to thrive, without recognition to give, and never ask for anything in return. It's not that parents or siblings mean to wound us, it's that they forget we have limits too. The lesson that settled over me that day was a bittersweet one: being needed is not the same as being valued. I realized I had spent years earning my family's trust, but not their tenderness. I had given so much that my presence was assumed not appreciated. It wasn't about money or even fairness, it was about feeling seen. For so long, I thought my sacrifices would eventually be rewarded with gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. But in the quiet of that Thursday, I finally saw that sometimes being indispensable means you are invisible. That night, after leaving my parents' house, I sat in my car and let the weight of it all settle in. I could have confronted them then, and there demanded an explanation, a change, a sign that my worth wasn't just in what I could provide. But I didn't. Instead, I drove home in silence, letting the anger and sorrow blend into something quieter: resolve. If my family could write me out of their story with so little thought, maybe it was time I started writing myself back in on my own terms. And so, with the sharp clarity that only heartbreak can bring, I began to consider a new question, one that would reshape everything. What would my life look like if I stopped waiting for others to see my worth and started living as if it mattered? That question, as it turns out, would be the first step on a path I never expected to walk: a journey toward boundaries. Healing and learning to choose myself, even when it meant saying no to those I loved. Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from harsh words or grand betrayals, but from soft, familiar phrases meant to comfort or explain. After I discovered the will, my mother and I sat together on the porch swing, the one I'd repaired with my own hands, watching late sunlight drift through the oak leaves. She wore her favorite cardigan and twisted the hem between her fingers, a habit she had whenever she had something heavy to say. Her voice was gentle. "We didn't mean for you to find out that way, Madison." She reached for my hand and called me steady, strong, reliable. Words meant as praise, but somehow they landed with the weight of 1,000 small disappointments. For a long time, I believed that being strong was my greatest quality. My parents had always said it with pride: Madison's the dependable one, the one we never have to worry about. I wore that label like armor, hoping it made me special. But in that moment, I saw its sharp edges. Being strong became the reason I was left out, the excuse for why my needs were never prioritized, the rationale for pouring everything into Max. I tried to imagine a version of my life where I could admit to feeling lost, or tired, or just wanting to be taken care of for once. But that wasn't the Madison my family knew, or maybe even wanted. It's a common story hidden in the corners of so many families. The child who gets labeled the rock or the caretaker is quietly set apart from tenderness. A close friend once told me how her older sister was always expected to solve every problem and absorb every crisis, while her younger brother received endless forgiveness for every misstep. "We love you because you're strong," their parents would say. "Your brother just needs more help." That logic, so subtle and so widespread, becomes a kind of emotional shorthand. In American families especially, there's often an unspoken rule that the person who handles things best is asked to handle more. The flip side is rarely considered that even the strongest need support, that even the most reliable can feel forgotten. Psychologists call this parental favoritism, and studies show its impact lingers well into adulthood. When love is conditional, granted based on perceived need, or withheld in the name of resilience, it carves deep, invisible scars. You learn to equate affection with usefulness, attention with achievement, and acceptance with self-denial. Over time, you may even lose touch with your own desires, mistaking self-abandonment for strength. In therapy, I once described my family's love as practical, always present in emergencies, but rarely gentle or affirming. My therapist asked, "When was the last time you felt cherished simply for being yourself, not for what you could do?" The question stunned me. I had no answer. The sad irony is that being strong often becomes a convenient reason for loved ones to stop trying. When my parents told me they left everything to Max because he needed the help, I heard what wasn't being said, that my own needs were invisible, not because they didn't exist, but because they were too easy to ignore. It's a pattern I see in so many lives: a colleague who carries the emotional labor at work, a friend who organizes every family gathering, but is rarely asked about her own day. The world is quick to praise the reliable and steady, but that praise too often substitutes for real care. The lesson I've learned slowly and sometimes painfully is that being called strong isn't always a compliment. It can be a cage locking you into a role that's as exhausting as it is lonely. True love, I've realized, doesn't divide itself based on need or resilience. It asks instead, what do you want? What makes you feel safe, seen, held? And if those questions go unasked, it's necessary even to seek answers beyond the boundaries of family. Sitting on that porch swing with my mother, I finally let myself say the words I'd always swallowed. "You could have told me. You could have asked." For the first time, I watched her hesitate, searching for a response that wouldn't come. Her silence said more than any apology could. There was no villain here, only habits, hopes, and fears passed down quietly, unexamined for generations. Sometimes families cling to their patterns because it feels safer than change, even when it hurts the ones they love most. As the evening settled and the air grew cool, I knew something had shifted in me. The label of the strong one no longer fit so neatly. It was fraying at the edges. I couldn't go back to being invisible, couldn't keep pretending my worth was measured only by what I could provide. And though I didn't have all the answers, I sensed that true healing would begin with a single step, a small act of self-recognition, a gentle refusal to bear more than my share. I stood up, letting the porch swing fall silent behind me, and walked inside, knowing that the hardest part of loving anyone, family included, is learning when to stop sacrificing yourself for their comfort. Little did I know setting boundaries would prove harder than I imagined. Because when the reliable one finally says enough, families rarely know what to do with the silence that follows. But I was ready, or at least willing to discover who I might become once I stopped living only for others. And that, I decided, would be the truest strength of all. The first time you say no to family, it doesn't echo through the house like thunder. It's quieter. A missed phone call, a message left unanswered, a bill unpaid that used to be covered before anyone could ask. I remember the day I chose not to refill my parents' grocery account, my finger hovering over the submit payment button before I finally closed the app. It wasn't a declaration or a protest. It was a small, silent rebellion against the role I'd accepted for so long. And though the world didn't shift, something in me did. I felt both lighter and more exposed, as if I'd stepped outside without a coat on a chilly spring morning. It wasn't long before my absence was felt. A week passed, then two, before my dad texted to ask why the water bill was higher than usual. I wanted to explain, wanted to say I was tired, or that I needed someone to ask how I was for a change. But the words didn't come, so I said nothing at all. The silence grew louder with each passing day, punctuated by gentle reminders. "The mortgage is due soon, Maddie," or "Don't forget to order your mother's medication." I watched my phone light up, resisting the urge to make everything right. For the first time in years, I was letting a mess unfold without rushing in to clean it. What surprised me most wasn't my family's confusion, it was my own discomfort. I'd always assumed that deep down I wanted to help. But now, with the weight lifted, I realized I was just as afraid of being needed as I was of being forgotten. There's a peculiar guilt that comes with setting boundaries, especially in families like mine, where love and obligation are hopelessly tangled. I worried my absence would look like cruelty, that my parents would believe I'd stopped caring. The truth, though, was simpler. I needed to care for myself for once before I could care for anyone else again. I wasn't alone in this struggle. Over coffee one afternoon, my friend Lauren told me about the year she decided to stop being her siblings' emergency contact. For as long as she could remember, every family crisis landed on her doorstep: car accidents, late-night bailouts, forgotten birthdays. At first I thought I was the glue, she said, stirring her cup. But then I realized I was the net. They never learned to catch themselves because they always assumed I'd be there. It took her months to stop answering every frantic call, to trust that her family could survive a little discomfort. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way she ever found peace. Setting boundaries isn't about shutting people out. It's about inviting them to see you as a whole person, not just a resource. For me, this meant choosing which requests to honor and which ones to release. When Max texted asking for help with rent yet again, I hesitated, then replied, "I can't this month, Max. I'm taking care of some things for myself." There was a pause, then a curt, "Okay," and I braced for the guilt trip that never came. Sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes they adjust faster than you expect, not because they want to, but because they have to. Other times, as with my parents, silence is the reply, but even that silence is information. It's proof that something is shifting. The lesson I learned in fits and starts is that boundaries don't make you a bad daughter, sister, or friend. They make you honest. They give everyone a chance to grow, even if it's uncomfortable at first. I realized I'd spent so long trying to protect my family from pain that I'd forgotten they were capable of surviving it. By stepping back, I offered them the chance to develop resilience of their own. And I gave myself the grace to rest, to dream, to imagine a life not built solely around other people's needs. Of course, breaking the cycle didn't come without backlash. As the weeks passed, I felt a chill settle into my relationship with my parents. The cheerful check-in calls grew less frequent, replaced by terse messages about money or bills. Max started calling Dad instead of me, and for a while I wondered if I'd lost more than I'd gained. But as I sat alone in my apartment cooking dinner for one and letting my mind wander, I felt a fragile sense of freedom bloom inside me. I was no longer the family's safety net. I was simply Madison, a woman learning to trust that she was enough even when she wasn't needed. Little did I know the true test of my new boundaries was still to come. Because when a family grows accustomed to always being rescued, the first real crisis reveals what everyone is truly made of. And as another storm began to gather over my parents' finances, I would have to decide once and for all how much I was willing to lose for the sake of holding on. At first, the silence from my parents felt unfamiliar but almost peaceful. For years, I'd been the one to call to text to double-check that everything was running smoothly. Now, as weeks slipped by, the stillness became a strange kind of company. But silence in families is rarely just absence. Often it's the hush before a different kind of storm. When you set boundaries after years of saying yes, people don't always ask what changed. Instead, they look for someone to blame for the discomfort your absence brings. It wasn't long before I realized my family was writing a new story. One where I was the problem, not the solution. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, a comment from my mother on Facebook about how hard it is when children grow up and forget what you've done for them. There was no mention of names, but the meaning was clear to anyone who knew us. Then came the messages from relatives, an aunt checking in a cousin, suddenly nostalgic for the old days, both echoing a concern that seemed rehearsed. "Your parents miss you, Madison," they'd write. "Maybe just give them a call. Family is everything you know." The guilt crept in with each note, weaving itself through my resolve like ivy on a fence. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if setting boundaries made me cold or selfish. That's the insidious power of the blame game. It makes you question not only your choices, but your character. But families don't just share love, they share stories too. And when someone steps out of a familiar role, the narrative can twist in surprising ways. My dad, who used to call only when something needed fixing, began posting about sacrifice and thankless children. Max, ever the optimist in public, shared a picture of the family home with a caption about showing up for those who matter. The comments piled up: heart emojis, encouragement from neighbors, even subtle digs from people I barely knew. For the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider looking in on my own history, watching as the past was rewritten, my years of support quietly erased in favor of a new plotline: Madison, the absent daughter. It was painful but not unfamiliar. I've heard similar stories from friends and colleagues, people who drew the line with toxic parents or siblings, only to find themselves painted as villains in the family portrait. There's Jenna, who paid her father's medical bills for years, then finally said no, and watched as he told everyone she'd abandoned him. Or Marcus, who stopped co-signing loans for his brother and suddenly became the greedy one at family dinners. In each case, the family's discomfort with change transformed into a campaign of subtle blame, designed not just to protect the old order, but to bring the wayward child back in line. Why do families do this? In part, it's about preserving a sense of innocence, the idea that if someone's unhappy, it must be someone else's fault. Psychologists call this scapegoating, redirecting pain outward, rather than confronting it within. It's easier to accuse the boundary setter of being heartless than to ask why the family needed rescuing in the first place. This rewriting of history serves everyone but the person who finally spoke up. It keeps the system running even if it's at the cost of truth and trust. What I learned through this uncomfortable season was that being blamed doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes blame is just the echo of someone else's fear. Fear of change, fear of accountability, fear of having to grow. My own fear, the worry that I'd lose my family forever, slowly began to soften as I realized I wasn't alone. So many people are quietly holding up the world for others, only to be left holding the blame when they let go. The lesson I carry now is that your worth isn't measured by how well you keep the peace. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else be uncomfortable and trust that you deserve the space you've claimed for yourself. Of course, letting go of blame is easier said than done. The ache of being misunderstood, of watching your good intentions twisted into something unrecognizable, can linger like a bruise. But the upside, if you can endure it, is clarity. For the first time, I could see my family's patterns for what they were: ways of coping, yes, but also ways of avoiding the truth. I began to grieve not just the loss of closeness, but the loss of the story I'd always wanted to believe in, a story where love was enough and being strong meant you'd always be valued. Yet as the weeks turned to months, a quiet strength grew inside me. I wasn't responsible for the feelings others projected onto me. I could choose compassion without surrendering my boundaries. And most of all, I could learn to trust my own story, even if it wasn't the one my family told about me. This wasn't the ending I would have chosen, but it was the beginning of something real, a chance to build a life on honesty, not obligation. The real test, I knew, would come when the next crisis arrived. Would my family accept my new boundaries or try to pull me back into my old role? As autumn settled in and a familiar sense of urgency crept into our group texts, I realized it was only a matter of time before I'd have to choose again between rescuing them and rescuing myself. When you finally step back, you expect the world to end, or at least that your absence will cause the house to crumble in on itself. But when my family's crisis finally arrived, it didn't happen all at once. Instead, it came in slow, small waves: a missed payment here, a for sale sign in the front yard. There a voicemail from my dad that was less about catching up and more about asking for help, one more time. The house I'd helped save so many times before now felt like someone else's problem, and that knowledge hurt more than I could admit. The first autumn rain leaked through the kitchen ceiling, and for the first time in years, I didn't rush over with a checkbook or a toolbox. I watched from afar as the problems multiplied, and my family, so used to my steady hands, tried to keep everything together without me. I'd heard stories from friends who'd gone through the same thing. Jenna told me about her brother who only called when he needed money and disappeared the moment she said she couldn't help anymore. The silence that followed wasn't just emptiness. It was grief, the loss of the person you were and the roles you played for each other. Another friend, Olivia, described watching her parents' business go under after years of covering their bills in secret. "It's like you're letting the ship sink," she said, "but you're finally learning how to swim." I recognized that feeling in myself as the months wore on. Every day I resisted the urge to fix things, to rush in and make it all better. I felt both weaker and stronger. It was a confusing, bittersweet kind of freedom. The price of letting go, I realized, wasn't just measured in dollars or lost time. It was measured in all the little heartbreaks: watching a childhood home slip away, hearing the disappointment in my parents' voices, feeling the sting of old photos popping up on social media with captions that painted me as the missing piece. My family was struggling, and I felt the ache of their discomfort even from a distance. But I also saw in small ways that they were beginning to cope on their own. Max started picking up more hours at work. My parents learned to ask neighbors for help instead of expecting me to appear like magic. For the first time, they had to find solutions that didn't involve me sacrificing myself. There's a quiet dignity in letting people learn from their own struggles. I remembered something a counselor once told me. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let others face their own consequences. I thought of all the years I'd protected my family from pain, only to end up carrying it alone. I realize now that pain, as hard as it is to watch, can be a great teacher. My parents' discomfort forced them to adapt. Max's disappointments nudged him toward accountability. In a strange way, my absence was a kind of gift, an uncomfortable one perhaps, but a necessary one. Of course, the temptation to jump back in never fully disappeared. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, bargaining with myself about just one more loan, one more late-night grocery run, one more apology for setting limits. But each time I reached for my phone, I remembered how it felt to be invisible in my own story. I asked myself if rescuing them would really change anything, or if it would just drag us all back into old patterns. Slowly, with the help of friends, I learned to trust that I could love my family without being responsible for every outcome. That was the hardest lesson of all. Love doesn't always mean stepping in. Sometimes it means letting go. As winter approached and the house finally went up for sale, I visited my old neighborhood one last time. The grass was overgrown and the porch swing I'd fixed was gone. I stood across the street, hands deep in my pockets, watching as strangers toured the place I once called home. There was sadness, yes, but also relief. The house was never mine to keep safe forever. I had done what I could, and now it was time to let the past settle into memory. With the sale of the house, a chapter closed not just for my family, but for the version of myself I'd carried for so long. There was pain, but also possibility. I began to ask for the first time in my adult life what it might mean to build something new from the pieces left behind. Could I create a sense of home within myself? Could my family and I learn to relate in healthier, more honest ways, even as the old structures crumbled? Little did I know true healing would require more than just letting go. It would mean rebuilding not just houses or relationships, but the very foundation of how I saw myself. And as I took my first tentative steps into this unfamiliar territory, I realized that freedom was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a life where I was finally allowed to be whole. You always imagine confrontations as loud, dramatic, maybe even cathartic. But when my parents and Max finally appeared at my door, it wasn't thunderous at all. It was awkward quiet, each of them holding on to their own version of what had gone wrong. They stood in the lobby of my apartment building, shuffling their feet, glancing at each other, as if waiting for someone else to start. For a moment, I almost turned back upstairs, wanting to avoid the inevitable conversation. But I steadied myself and walked toward them, heart pounding not out of anger, but out of the hope that something honest might finally be spoken. My mother's eyes were red, her hands clutching her purse the way she did at funerals. Dad's jaw was tight, a crease deepening between his brows. Max, usually so carefree, looked more like a lost boy than the man he pretended to be online. Mom started first, her voice wavering. "We're here because we don't understand." "Why are you doing this, Madison? Why would you just walk away?" Her words stung, but I noticed the absence of blame this time, just confusion, sadness, fear. I took a breath, reminding myself not to rush in with an apology, because I needed to choose myself for once. I said quietly, "I can't keep holding everyone else up while I'm sinking." They pushed back in the ways they knew best. Dad spoke about everything he and Mom had sacrificed, how they'd done their best to give us a better life. He said, "We fed you, raised you, taught you to be strong. You owe us that much, don't you?" Max looked away, silent, fiddling with his phone. I could feel the old roles tugging at me, begging me to fold, to step back into the person I'd always been. But the words wouldn't come. I saw the tiredness in my parents' faces, the exhaustion of carrying their own burdens for the first time in years, and I realized this moment wasn't just about me. It was about letting all of us learn something different. I thought about stories from friends who had stood their ground. My friend Rena had once described facing her mother after refusing to be the family's financial safety net any longer. It was like breaking a spell, she told me. At first, everyone was angry, but later, there was a strange kind of peace, like we all had room to breathe. I realize now how true that was. Setting boundaries isn't just about pushing people away, it's about inviting them to grow, to find new ways of relating. My voice shook, but I spoke anyway. I love you all. But love doesn't mean losing myself. I won't go back to being invisible just to make things easier. We stood there, the four of us, suspended between the past and whatever might come next. My father's face softened for the first time, the anger melting into something like regret. My mother began to cry quietly, and for once I let her. I didn't offer tissues, didn't try to fix it. Instead, I told them the truth, that I wanted a relationship built on honesty and respect, not obligation. That I hoped they could find a way to be proud of me, not for what I did for them, but for who I was learning to become. It was the hardest conversation of my life, not because anyone shouted, but because nobody did. There was only silence and the shifting of old stories. I know not every family gets this chance. Sometimes doors are closed forever. Sometimes the silence never ends. But in that moment, I saw a sliver of possibility, an opening where something new could grow. Not perfect, not easy, but real. The lesson from that day is one I carry still. You can't change people's minds for them, and you can't force anyone to see your worth, but you can insist on your own truth. You can stand your ground even when your knees shake. Boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges to healthier relationships if both sides are willing to cross. If not, there's still a path to peace within yourself. As my family left that afternoon, nothing was fully resolved. There were still questions, still hurt, feelings, still uncertainty about what would happen next. But as I closed the door and leaned against it, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's story. I was standing on my own, uncertain but free. What I didn't know then was that real healing, the kind that lasts, would take more than one conversation. It would require rebuilding trust, learning new habits, and forgiving not just my family but myself. And as I took a deep breath and stepped back into my quiet apartment, I realized this was only the beginning of the next chapter, learning how to heal the invisible wounds and rediscover who I was now that I'd let go. After the confrontation faded into memory, the quiet in my life felt different than before. Not hollow, but almost tender, like the hush after a rainstorm. For the first time in years, my days belonged only to me. There was relief in the silence, but also a raw ache I hadn't expected. It turns out, even healthy boundaries can leave scars. I found myself wandering through the rooms of my small apartment, uncertain of who I was, without the constant current of family needs to pull me along. Simple routines, cooking for one, planning weekends with friends, felt both liberating and lonely. Sometimes I missed the old roles, even the ones that hurt. Letting go of my family's expectations meant letting go of a version of myself I'd been building my whole life. I soon learned that healing from family estrangement isn't a single event. It's a slow, winding road. At first, I struggled with guilt. The urge to check on my parents or send money to Max would sneak up on me in the middle of the night. Some mornings I reached for my phone instinctively, half expecting another crisis. But as the weeks passed, the absence of emergencies became its own kind of comfort. I started seeing a therapist, a gentle, gray-haired woman named Dr. Field, who helped me untangle the knot of sadness and relief inside me. "You're allowed to grieve what you've lost," she told me, "but you're also allowed to celebrate what you're creating for yourself." It was the first time anyone had put those two truths side by side. In therapy, I realized I wasn't alone in my story. Dr. Field connected me to a small support group of people, rebuilding their lives after difficult family dynamics. There was Ben, whose mother hadn't spoken to him since he refused to fund his younger brother's failed businesses, and Marissa, who found solace in chosen family after years of being the fixer for siblings who never thanked her. Listening to their stories helped me see my own pain with new clarity. We shared our small victories, setting limits, saying no, forgiving ourselves for not being able to save everyone. The comfort wasn't in fixing each other, but in knowing we were no longer alone in our struggles. With time, I began to fill the empty spaces in my life with things that brought me genuine joy. I started a ceramics class on Saturdays, letting my hands shape lumps of clay into imperfect, beautiful bowls. I rekindled old friendships I'd neglected, meeting for long walks in the city or quiet evenings over coffee. Each act of self-kindness felt radical after so many years of self-sacrifice. I learned to treat myself as gently as I'd once treated my family, taking care to rest, to laugh, to dream again. There were setbacks, of course, birthdays that felt strange, holidays that ached with absence, the quiet longing for a simpler past. But slowly, I found a sense of belonging in places I never expected, and a new, softer identity took root. One day, I ran into a neighbor, Mrs. Harris, in the lobby, a woman I'd always helped with her groceries when I was rushing to help my parents. She asked how my family was, and I hesitated before answering. "We're finding new ways to care for each other." It was honest if incomplete. Later, as I carried my own groceries up the stairs, I realized that healing doesn't mean forgetting the people we love or pretending the pain never happened. It means learning to accept the messiness of our relationships and forgiving ourselves for the boundaries we had to draw. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family and yourself is to step back and let everyone grow in their own way. The lesson I learned through all of this is simple but profound. Your worth is not tied to what you give or how much you endure. Healing is about reclaiming your right to be cared for too, to build a life that is yours, not just a support system for others. I wish someone had told me sooner that family can be chosen, that love can be found and rebuilt in community, creativity, and self-acceptance. It isn't easy, and there are still days I stumble, but I am learning to measure my value in moments of peace, not in crises averted. As I looked back on all the versions of myself I'd played, the helper, the fixer, the strong one, I felt gratitude, not regret. Each role had taught me something about compassion, resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to change. But now, standing on the threshold of a new life, I knew the next chapter would be different. It would be written not out of obligation, but out of hope. The final lesson in the last part of my story is not just about survival. It's about learning to forgive, to move forward, and to build a life filled with freedom and gentle new beginnings. Because sometimes the truest home you can find is the one you create within yourself. One boundary, one breath, one brave choice at a time. Freedom, I learned, is not just the absence of responsibility, it's the presence of possibility. After all the letting go, grieving and healing, my life took on a quiet openness I hadn't known before. Each morning felt lighter, my choices untethered from the weight of expectation. It was a new sensation, this power to choose not out of fear or duty, but out of genuine desire. I began to ask myself small, hopeful questions. What do I want to try next? Where do I want to travel? Who do I want to be when no one is watching? The answers came slowly, but they came, and with each step, I grew a little braver. Freedom, I discovered, is built one tiny act of self-trust at a time. Forgiveness, though, was a different journey. For a long time, I believed forgiveness was something you gave only to others, a gift perhaps for those who had let you down. But the more I lived with my new boundaries, the more I realized that forgiveness begins at home. I had to forgive myself for the years I'd spent trying to be everything for everyone, for the times I'd lost my temper, for the moments I'd wished my family was different. And most of all, I had to forgive them not for their choices, but for being human, for loving imperfectly, for not knowing how to give what I needed. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing the hurt. It meant releasing the hope that the past could be different and letting myself move forward with a lighter heart. The beauty of starting over is that it opens the door to unexpected joys. In the year after my family's home was sold, I planted a small herb garden on my apartment balcony, a tiny claim to something all my own. I adopted a rescue dog named Willow, whose gentle eyes and patient presence made each evening softer. I found friendship in places I never expected: the ceramic studio, neighborhood book clubs, even online communities where others told their stories of healing after family estrangement. Some of us found our chosen family in each other, a patchwork of kindness, encouragement, and shared hope. There were setbacks, of course, and days when old griefs would resurface, but the support and understanding made each hurdle feel possible. One moment stands out. I received a letter from Max, written in his messy script months after our confrontation. He apologized for not understanding my pain, for expecting me to fix what he should have faced himself. "I don't know if I can change overnight," he wrote, "but I want to try." I cried when I read it, not because everything was suddenly healed, but because there was room now for honesty, for rebuilding something new. Forgiveness is not a finish line, but a beginning, a chance for relationships to grow at their own pace. Sometimes forgiveness means accepting that some doors may stay closed, and that's okay too. The lesson I carry now, and hope you'll carry with you, is this: You are not responsible for making everyone else whole at the expense of your own well-being. It is not selfish to draw boundaries to rest or to chase your own happiness. Real love, whether from family, friends, or the community you build, makes space for you to be both strong and vulnerable, both giving and receiving. And if you've ever found yourself carrying too much, remember letting go is not a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is the most courageous thing you can do. As seasons changed and my heart softened, I saw my story reflected in the lives of so many others people who had chosen themselves after years of silence, who had rebuilt with patience and hope. Maybe your story is like mine. Maybe you're still in the messy middle, or maybe you're standing at the edge wondering what will happen if you walk away from what no longer serves you. If so, know this: you are not alone. There is freedom on the other side of goodbye, and forgiveness of yourself and others can be the key that unlocks it. So here at the end of my story, I offer you this gentle invitation. Trust your own journey. Surround yourself with those who see and honor your whole self. Celebrate each small victory, and when the time comes, step boldly into the life you choose. Healing is not a destination, it's a way of walking. May each step bring you closer to the home you deserve, the one you build for yourself, with love and courage every single day. Thank you for listening, for sharing this journey, and for believing that you too are worthy of freedom, forgiveness, and a future filled with hope. If my story resonates with you, I hope you'll share yours, because sometimes the greatest healing comes from knowing we're not alone.